Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Today is Thursday, August 11th, 2022. This is an oral history interview with Tae Yoo being conducted by Kristin Morris, Cisco archivist. At the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, this interview is being conducted as part of a joint project between the Center for Cisco Heritage and the Computer History Museum. Tae, thank you so much for being with us today and agreeing to talk about your role and Cisco's role in corporate philanthropy. I do always like to start our interviews with a very basic introduction to you, and that starts at the beginning. When and where were you born?
When and where? I don't think we should be giving out dates.
You don't have to give me a date.
I'm originally from the East Coast, which is where I went to school, and when I graduated and I wanted to be in the IT industry, everyone said, "Go west, young woman." Because Silicon Valley, Steve Jobs is a whole, you probably know more than I can ever explain the importance of Silicon Valley, and particularly to Cisco. So I came out here, and what I did originally for Cisco was Ed Kozel and I, we co-founded the business development arm of Cisco back in 1989.
So you were hired in 1989, and what was your college degree in, or what?
It was in communications.
Oh, okay.
And but I wanted to apply it within the IT sector, and it was a place where you could actually thrive in the sector, and whether your first job was the right landing place or not, it didn't matter. This is basically a technology cluster. And you're able to there was a natural partnership when you have clusters, whether it's an incubator or a technology cluster, which this was, and it was by natural purposes. It happened by default, and I knew that I'd have an opportunity at multiple places, and that's one of the reasons why I came out here. Yeah.
And how did you get the job at Cisco initially? How did you find that job?
Well, so one of my first jobs out of school was with a company called Bridge Communications, and that was a really important lesson because Bridge Communications then merged with 3Com. So to be very young and not expecting a merger, you learn a lot from that process. And Kate Muther, who eventually came to Cisco as basically the chief marketing officer, was the one who called and said that there's an opportunity here, and I think that you really should apply for the job. So I did, and the rest is history.
So you started in business development. Tell me a little bit about that work in the early years of Cisco.
So what you had was, because of the nature of our technology, it was integrated and had to work well with other components in a networking infrastructure. And because of that, there was a natural partnership that had to happen. And what we found was that there was I don't want to get kind of wonky, I'm sure you had a lot of those interviews with everybody else, but you had this natural, what I call collisions, natural collisions where you integrate with other vendors' products. And so what we wanted to do was, how do we help the customer by integrating our technology within companies like what we called the hub vendors. So in those days, it was Synoptics, Cabletron, Chipcom, and Synoptics went on to merge with Wellfleet, which was then acquired by Nortel. I mean, you could trace the heritage of so many companies, and we actually put our technology into their infrastructure. So that was the thing that one of the first things that I worked on. I also worked on, the GSA government business in terms of creating partnerships there. So there was a lot of business development that was going on, which was really exciting, particularly in a growing company, in an industry where you were moving from, layer 2 bridges to layer 3 networking, and all the things that possibilities that opened up. It was very exciting.
And how long did you work in that area?
I did that, and then I went and lived in Europe, running the international, European-based international distribution channels. So I was on the sales piece of that for many years, and then I took a little bit of time off to come back to the States. My father was dying of cancer, and I just needed some time to. You only get one chance to do that, right? And I decided that I was going to take some time off, and it was a really important time because that's when I really started thinking about, the purpose. Everyone calls it purpose now, but that's not a new term. People have been seeking purpose, since time began. And I really looked at the things we always said as a company is create unprecedented value. That was a word that we always used at Cisco, is how do we create unprecedented value for our customers, our shareholders, our partners, our employees. And I thought, well, why not communities on top of that? And I saw the impact that our technology had on our customers and how they could leapfrog old technologies and really be able to get tangible results and help our customers to be successful. And I thought, what if we looked at it from the perspective of those who would not be natural customers of Cisco, the community-based organizations, the NGOs, and not just in the States or in Europe, but in developing countries. And so it was just really important to look at it from that perspective. And so when I did come back, I pitched this idea. And
Who did you pitch it to?
John Chambers.
Okay.
So John Chambers, when I told him I needed to take some time off, he made me promise to come back, and he made me shake his hand. So, a promise is a deed. And so I really had kind of a dilemma, because if I come back, what am I coming back to? He had some things he wanted me to work on, and I said, well, I appreciate that, but that's not really what I want to do. What about this? And he thought it through. Because I came from the business and, I understood the company and the technology, I had to put it into a business proposal. And that's what I did. And John, being the far-sighted person that he was very, very supportive of it and said, okay, take a run for it. But I knew that if it didn't work out, that I kind of owed him and would have to work on other things, and I was willing to do that. It was worth it. It was worth it.
So let's go back just a little bit and tell me about sort of Cisco's philanthropic efforts during those early years before you pitched this idea.
So if you look at just, a company, culture is a really interesting thing, It's very hard for people to define it succinctly in a way that is meaningful to the layperson. But every single person innately understands culture. The culture of your social groups, your family, your company, your community. And so what was so important was that Sandy Lerner, first of all, Cisco wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Sandy Lerner. And I think that that's something that I try to keep impressing upon people. She saw the technology and she understood the potential of it. A lot of people understood the potential, but Sandy took action, and she instilled this culture of customer advocacy, customer success. It was something that she did from the very beginning, and she also had a very heavy philanthropic streak. So for Sandy, it was never one-dimensional. She was very passionate about the environment. So let me give you a little bit of example that we all knew that recycling and just even the basic things had to be done at Cisco. And it was my second day at Cisco. I was in my little cubicle and I was on the phone with a customer. Somebody taps me on the shoulder, puts a box in my cubicle, takes something out of my trash can and put it in the box and said, "We recycle here. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, but let's start there," and walked away. Not hi, hello, how are you? But that was really, really important because, and later on I was able to have conversations with her about recycling, and more importantly, it's not just that recycling is a transaction. There was a broader discussion on environmental and climate. So we see that, and so she always encouraged various activities. John Morgridge, who really turned Cisco into he took us public as a company, turned us into, made that jump from a startup to a company. And he was also very, very philanthropic in a much more strategic way, but also looks at it from a deep-seated, let's get employees engaged. So Cisco's culture was top-down and bottoms-up.
There were also, I think, some efforts at just very immediate community participation efforts,
Absolutely.
volunteerism.
So, we talk about, there's the storied history in the valley, about Silicon Valley, about the garage, startup in the garage. So Len and Sandy started up in their living room with a beautiful piano, but that was their kind of, I think there was a DEC 20 mainframe, which Len had worked on in their garage. But when we got to our first real offices and where we were when we went public, it was in a place called Menlo Park, but it was East Menlo Park, which bordered on East Palo Alto, which at one point in time had the highest homicide rate in the country at one point. And that was our community. And I remember coming in, I'd have customers who would come in for meetings, part of our business development meetings, and first of all, they'd be late. I would get a call and say, well, I think you gave me bad directions, start describing the neighborhood. And I said, oh, no, you're going the right way. Come on over. And I remember interviewing somebody, and he called me later, and I said, we want to make you an offer. And he said, I would love to work for this company. I love the technology. I love the people. There was only one little thing. When I went out to my car, I saw a bullet casing, empty bullet casing. I was like, oh, yeah, it was just one or two. Don't worry about it. But that was our community. And so what you saw was, that when I talk about bottoms up, is employees took the initiative. They climbed a fence and went to Castaño Elementary School. They got to know the principal, and then they would then encourage the rest of us to go over there and paint the building. Every time we were able to upgrade our furniture, the old furniture went over there. Every time we had an event, anything that was not perishable then went over to Castaño. So, these were things, nobody told us to do it. And then what you saw was John Morgers looking at, well, how do we work with school systems? And he really got close to the principal at Castaño. He worked with, the nonprofit organizations who actually would come into schools and provide extra training, and he was engaged in that. And his wife Tasha Morgers used to come and do reading. I mean, it was just who we were. We'd have Take Your Children to Work Day before it was Take Your Children to Work. We had Career Day when students from Castaño showed up at Cisco and shadowed us, and this was all just very organic. But that's kind of the setup of what turned into a very strong culture. And of course, John Chambers comes and takes it to a whole different level, because he looked at it very globally and very deeply in terms of measurements and outcomes.
So your pitch to John, was that for the Cisco Foundation, basically?
Well, no. So so Cisco Foundation, there's a beautiful story around that. So when you look at the way we were positioned in the customer base, primarily local area networking with some wide area access points. What was happening was we would partner with those who played in the wide area networking. So there was always this overlap. If you look at a Venn diagram, there's an overlap. But what we were finding is that we needed to be more embedded in that. So we made an equity investment in a company called Cascade Communications, who later on went to be acquired by some of our competitors. But in the meantime, we were working together, and what we decided was that we needed to actually acquire a company. And so I know we had conversations with Cascade, but I guess the net of it is that we wanted to, I think, and you need to double check this, I think we wanted to pay $4 billion and they wanted $6 billion, I think. So that's, you have to double check the facts on that. So we ended up acquiring Stratacom Communications. So when we acquired Stratacom, we didn't think it was appropriate to hold competitors' equity. So we sold off that $1 million investment, which turned into a $65 million return. And with that, John Morgridge and Larry Carter funded the Cisco Foundation. So that was all happening concurrently. I was not engaged with that. I inherited the foundation after John Chambers approved my proposal. So that's kind of how it started.
I see. So the Cisco Foundation, so that would have been in 1997.
Well, 1996 is when
yeah.
the Stratacom acquisition happened, and then, between 96 and 97 is when, 1970 is actually when the foundation was endowed.
And then your proposal was going through.
Was looking at all these. I was looking at all these disparate parts and realizing that there was one really important piece of this, which was the technology and the work we did every single day. The technology we used every day, the development that we were doing, and the networks that we were building for our customers actually had a very strategic role, in the NGO, nonprofit, community-based organization, and global development, and who would never have access to these things, not for decades to come.
So you created a new department.
Yes, yes, we did.
It wasn't that simple, I'm sure.
Actually, it was very simple, but very complicated in application, and yet there was something in that was really important, which was, how do we take all these things that are happening and do a much more strategic lens? How do we look at this as a venture approach to the community? And philanthropy, first of all, philanthropy is basically a US, UK kind of term. It's not really a global term. I found that people had a really hard time pronouncing it. It didn't, everywhere. And if you have to spend a lot of time explaining what you do, then you need another name. So that's why we really looked at, strategic corporate affairs, which is that we look at all of our corporate assets and how do we then channel that towards specific outcomes in the areas that we cared about or we wanted to focus on. And that's kind of how it was born. That's how it was born. I set some very specific metrics. And one other important piece that was happening, so you had the foundation happening. You also had the transition from John Morgridge to John Chambers. So John Morgridge then takes on a passion project of his own. And never has a chairman been more active and more productive, I would say, up to that point than John Morgridge. And education, everyone knew how important education was. In fact, our corporate tagline, one of them was that, the internet and education could change the world, improve people's lives. There was a whole bunch of things that were going on around that. And so what was happening was, and this is where this is a direct connection to me, is that when I ran the channel partners, because we needed partners, we were pretty much a direct sales organization, direct support, because the technology was considered complicated. There were not a lot of people who knew how to design, install, and maintain networks. And so what we would do is, with the partnership program, if our partners got CCI certifications, Cisco Certified Internet Engineers, so if you got people in your company who certified, that way it gives us a level of comfort that our customers would be taken care of, you would get some benefits. So you might be a gold tier partner, a platinum partner. You would move up, because it wasn't just how much you sold, how much revenue you generated for Cisco. It was about how prepared you were and how well you serviced and protected our customers. And so what would happen is I'd have one partner who went through the expense and the investment of getting their engineers certified, CCIE certified. And then another partner would then recruit them for more money, because the certification went with the individuals. So then I get calls, so you talk about channel conflict in the distribution. I never thought that we would be conflicted over personnel. And that's exactly, human capital it turned out to be the linchpin. And so when the Networking Academy program started happening is that there was a window, and John Morgridge understood this better than anybody, because of course I would go down to his office because they'd be calling him. I said, by the way, you're gonna get a call because, this, and this. So one of the things he came up with was, how do we create a CCIE-like certification program and use this as another form of vocational training. And that was so pivotal. So we worked with a bunch of organizations and created CCNA, the Cisco Certified Network Associate Program. And we worked very closely with the TAC people. You know, Joe Pinto and I worked really closely together. He's been a good partner and advocate for me and the work that we did. So they came up with CCNA cert for, for non-career path, right? And so what we did is that's how the Networking Academy got started. So you had the foundation, you had Network Academy, and then you had all these efforts in the community. How do you bring those together under a much more strategic umbrella that's multi-year, that has very specific targets? I was in sales and business development. I had targets, and if you didn't meet those targets, they always said don't confuse effort with results. And that was pretty much how my whole career was. And so how do we set specific targets? How do we measure them? How do we stay with them? And how do we say that this is not a marketing tagline, this is not a marketing exercise, but rather this is really about outcomes? And that was the point where John Chambers said, this is the direction we're going to go. And that changed everything.
So in building up this approach, were there what were the models that you were looking to help you guide this effort to like you say, strategically bring all this together?
So that was the challenge, because there were a lot of examples. You look at exemplars everywhere. There's good stuff everywhere. I looked at private foundations. I looked at large institutional foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation. I looked at and then like research, like the Pew. Like Pew does lots of research. I mean, it was really, I looked at that. We looked at, Hewlett Packard at the time, HP, because of the tech bubble and the cost. If you look at, you probably know this better than I do, but if you look at the HP Foundation, the family, the private foundations, they had a lot of equity in HP, and when HP went up, they went up as well. So you saw that. I looked at companies. I looked at, so many companies and what they were doing, and everybody had good things. There was no I didn't see any duds. And then I looked at it, but what I noticed was that everybody had very specific things, and decided, first of all, we had to have a strategy just like we did for the business. You can't, you can't do everything, and we said that in the business as well. So how do you create a very specific mission and focus? How do you set up the strategy? The usual things that we do, and then how do you have the very specific objectives that you want to accomplish? How do you measure it? You talk about Six Sigma and all those things that were going on, and used a little, I took a little of that as well. So it was kind of this ability to pull all this stuff together, which is interesting because I was doing this when I had taken that time off while my father was dying of cancer, because of course I would wake up every day and make a list, and every night I would check things off, and if I did something that wasn't on my list, I wrote that down so I could check it off. So I had some time. I took almost 9 months. I had some time to do research. So I was doing all of this at the time, which helped me really solidify, now how does it apply to Cisco? And I think that was really important, was that, and part of it's the whole Valley mentality. If it doesn't exist, we'll create it. And so there was some of that going on as well. So it was just a combination of a lot of those things.
Were other companies in the Valley trying to leverage their technology?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely,
for good?
Absolutely. I think every organization does. Every once in a while, you'll have an outlier, but for the most part, we were all looking to figure out what worked for us. Some companies had top-down support, others did not. And sometimes we worked together when somebody would come and pitch an idea to us. And this is actually very different, is that if you look at the cycle of innovation, let me just kind of get a little wonky with you. Okay, so we divided into 4 quadrants. One was the ideation phase. You come up with this problem solution, just like you would in an incubator or in any place you find out you're solving a problem. So you have the ideation phase, and then you want to actually test it out, do some pilots, proof of concept. Then you say, oh, this works. Now the test is, can you, what we call RSS, which is repeatable, scalable, sustainable. So that's the third. And then the fourth is they come off and become self-sustaining. So if you look at the cycle of innovation, everybody is comfortable in phase 3. Somebody else paid for the ideation, somebody else paid for the proof of concept, and so you can invest all of your dollars in and treasure and time to scaling things up and putting it in multiple places, making it global or whatever. And so everyone likes, that's a comfortable stage. What I found was that, well, first of all, we're a tech company. We had a higher risk tolerance. We're used to venture capital. And so we thought, well, why don't we turn this into a VC model? Is that the ideation phase, maybe we're angel investors, or maybe, so that was the mentality. And so it enabled, that was game changer for me personally, because then all the restraints just went away and you could really focus on things. So we worked with an organization called Teachers Without Borders. And why this was important is that in parts of Africa, many of the population was dying of AIDS, and it included the teaching population. So, for instance, you might be somewhere and they would take, for instance, and this is just an example, maybe a cab driver who, because they were literate, sometimes you could put them in a classroom, but they needed to know how to manage the classroom. So they were literate, they were educated, but they didn't know how to teach. And so what Fred Mednick did was he created, teaching mastery course, which is to teach teachers how to, manage a classroom and those kinds of things. And that turned out to be in multiple countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So you saw that's not something you would naturally do, but because we did Network Academies and we understood that process, and we understood development, we understood software development. Actually, if you look at Network Academy and some of the programs, we actually had a deep understanding of software development even before some of the business did. So it was very interesting, what we learned through the process. And so we were able to do things like that. You look at ACFO and you think about water and how important that is. And so you would put it in, it was Water for People, actually, I think was the organization. It's been so long. But they would go in and they found a way to use technology to be able to see when water points went down. Because what happens is if water points go down, it takes a long time for them to get parts, to send people out there. And what this did was, was be able to remotely tell if water point was up or down over time. They wanted to make it much more sophisticated so they can measure pathogens. So if a water point had some, diseases, you could shut it down before people got sick. So there's a lot of things with that we tested out. And then they said, well, maybe we don't want, and Peter, I can tell you more about this than anyone else. I'm sure you talked to him. But, they decided, and this is what's so interesting about this venture model, was they said, okay, this is good. We've got good results. Now, we have so many countries using it, but this isn't our core business. Now, we all know the whole thing about core and context, right? So that's why we put out an RFP, and ACFO actually took over that piece. And so this is the continuity piece that's so important, is that we made an investment. They took it to a certain level, and now it was time to bring another partner in. We know how to do that in our sleep. That's what we do in the business, and that was the approach that we took. So that's just a couple examples of that.
So how did you, first of all, what were the priority areas, or how did you delineate your priority areas and guide your mission that way?
So every time something went wrong, everybody wanted us to do something. We usually did something, but it wasn't always what they wanted us to do. First of all, if you look at education, every single person that we worked with, customer, partner, prospect, employee, shareholder, knew something about education, because your kids, you went to school, your kids went to school, all of that. And so what we said was, there's two ways you can do this. There's the personal piece, which is your children's school, your alma mater. Let's say the foundation will match what you give personally. that's standard fare. Everybody's doing that. Go for it. Then we said, let's look strategically at it. Well, first of all, there is not enough dollars for any one company that you can, or even a group of companies. So what we said was, we want to focus on education that had a global footprint, which meant that it was technology-based. We're a technology company, we're a global company, and we want to scale it. The only way we're going to be able to take it to scale is through, a technology perspective. And so we narrowed it down to that, and we would look at it. So that's why Teachers Without Borders was important. That's, these are things that you can scale that way. And if they needed people, then that's through the volunteerism. That's why we separated the two of those in terms of, different ways to go to market, and that was the approach there. So that was one. We also focused very heavily on economic development. And this is why Networking Academies was so important. Because it's about economic development. It wasn't just education, it was economic development. And there's a lot of programs that we invested in around that. And then there was critical human needs, just some of the most basic things without which you can't move forward, to economic development. So we really honed it and narrowed it down, and underpinning all of that would be disaster relief. If something happens, that's just good, just being decent human beings. So that's basically how we approached it.
How did you identify partners, vet partners?
Well, just like you would in an investment portfolio. So if we set up something, a certain percentage, we would go looking. We do our own research, and over time we built up a research arm within within corporate affairs, and they did a lot of research for things we were looking for, and also when people came to us. And so that's basically how we did it. Sometimes people will come and apply for it. We set up website parameters around what we do focus on and how you apply for a grant. And there was different types of grants you could go for. Sometimes someone would say, I would just like, $50,000 to do X. We would look at it and say, wow, oh, this is much bigger than that. Because sometimes, and we know this in business, is that just because the price is low does not mean that it's a low risk, because you don't understand the opportunity behind that. When you're undercapitalized, great ideas go away just because of that. So sometimes, and MuralNet was one of those more recently, is that and I'm not sure that MuralNet is one we want to talk about yet, but this is a more recent example, so probably not that one. But they came to us for a very specific ask. We looked at it and said, this is a legitimate ask and we'll see good outcomes. However, our money would go further if we gave them more, because they'll just stop at this level, when really we need to see how it plays out 2 or 3 levels ahead to see if this could scale beyond that. So sometimes, we're careful about that we don't contribute to undercapitalizing something. And sometimes it's like you're asking for too much for what you're going. It's just any other due diligence. It's due diligence. We do that in business every day.
Right. Would you say that this level of investment is typical or atypical?
I think it's getting more typical. I think what I heard a lot from our peers was that they were surprised at the size of the investment. So for instance, after Hurricane Katrina, we made a $40 million investment in New Orleans and Mississippi. And so when we made that $40 million investment in New Orleans and Mississippi, it wasn't just for New Orleans and Mississippi. What we wanted to do was test out 21st century educational models, working in partnership with the state superintendent of schools, the county, the specific schools, the board of supervisors. So we worked with them to test out 21st century methodologies. If they're rebuilding, that's what we wanted to do. And we took a lot of the learnings from that and applied it to other areas. So that was, and what was special about that, and I just really want to do a shout out, is that both John Chambers and John Morgridge made personal investments. So the $28 million came from the company, but between John Morgridge and John Chambers, they made up the $12 million difference from their personal resources. So I think that's kind of rare. And they did this back in, mid 2000s. It was not a recent thing, and it was right around the time that after the bubble burst, and there was what I call the dark ages of growth. Probably one of the best things that ever happened to us was when the bubble burst, because it really taught us to be a sustainable company, right? Not just, doing really well for spurts at a time. And during that period, both John Chambers and John Morgridge took a reduction in salary. They took $1. Right? And yet, when this happened in Mississippi, Louisiana, they both stepped up personally. So it just speaks so much about their characters, and that they said what they meant, and they meant what they said. So I just feel so blessed to know them.
I looked at some of the material online from that 21st Century Schools initiative. It was a multi-year project.
That's right.
There was a lot of reporting and evaluation around it. There were local partners. There was a foundation set up that still exists and still.
So what we did was we again, because it was a big investment, we also wanted to learn from it. We partnered with the Education Data Unit. I think it was called EDU, Education Data Unit. And they actually did the measurements and reported it out. So we were able to do that. It gave us a chance to get to know the area better. It gave us a chance to work with teachers. What does the flipped classroom look like? I mean, all these conversations that are so common today was fairly nascent. We tried out a whole bunch of different methods with the teachers. We learned a lot about the fact that barriers to education is not just the education or the materials, it's lives and, so many other things that go into it. It gives you a very healthy appreciation for teachers and what they have to do in the classroom. You really appreciate the struggles of parents, many of whom had 2 or 3 jobs. So how do you then layer in support mechanisms and after school programs so that their children don't fall behind because they're trying to put food on the table and can't sit down with their children and help them with their homework. So this is, when you look at holistically what it takes to educate people is a lot of different things that you never thought. You thought it was so simple. You look at the world very simplistically until you actually theories and actuality. Sometimes there's a gap there. Yeah, that's good.
A couple of things that NetHope. I'd like to talk about NetHope with you.
I love NetHope. It's near and dear to my heart because NetHope. Well, to talk about NetHope, we have to go back. I have to give you a little context here. So in 2001, when the bubble burst, that was the very first time we had to lay employees off. And I would say it killed John Chambers to have to take that step. And so what we decided was how hard it was to hire people. Remember, it was, somebody would accept and then they would, the day they were supposed to start, they would say, oh, actually, I took a job from somebody else. And so we had to change our metrics in the company to not acceptance rates, but butts and seats. So, or shall we say, to people in seats, bodies in seats, okay, bodies in seats, because they actually showed up that first day instead of taking another offer. So we remembered all of those things, and we knew that this was going to be a moment in time, that it wasn't forever. So we wanted to find a way to keep connected with some of these employees. They were being laid off not because they weren't performing, but they were being laid off because there were parts of the business that we were not going to continue. So what we did was we thought, well, look, we've always said, remember this big idea we pitched, we've always said that there's lots of needs in the community, and the organizations, the nonprofits, the NGOs, the community-based organizations that service them need help. So why don't we come up with a plan? And we wanted to test again, everything is, we test a disaster is an opportunity to make things better the next time around. And that's how we looked at it. And so we worked with 81 organizations in the various communities where we had people. and said, what are your critical needs and can you use people? And it's not just people to come in and, work the phones. It's not necessarily people to come in and do administrative work. We have people who are in manufacturing, supply chain, marketing, business. I mean, these people, they could help you with fundraising. And so we had to make sure that they each had a job that was measurable and could apply their talents. And so Mike Utrank, God bless him, he had to manage over 81 people, immediately set up, MBOs, management by objectives, and for every single person, and work with about 20 plus organizations. And so that's what they did. And one of those organizations was with Ed Granger Happ, who was the CIO for Save the Children. And he really saw a problem that we saw as well, which was that you had, and I saw this firsthand because I actually went to Afghanistan in 2002 with UNDP, the UN Development Program, to launch the first Networking Academy program. While I was there, I was meeting with a bunch of NGOs, and what you saw was all these different NGOs that we're partners with, Save the Children, CARE, Catholic Relief Services, a whole bunch of them, and they all had the same needs, but they weren't coordinated. And that's when Ed Granger Happ's vision of how do we turn this into collaborative, so you can aggregate the needs of a communications infrastructure, which at that point in time was a luxury for many of the smaller, or even it was for the large ones, much less the smaller ones. And so we had seconded 2 people to be part of that, and that spun off into what was today known as NetHope. And we worked with Microsoft and Intel. It was a great partnership, and to this day we partner with them.
So would you say that Cisco was leading that charge with NetHope in terms of
Yes. No.
Then going out and
Absolutely.
reaching out to Microsoft, reaching out
Absolutely, yes, we
because
were.
Cisco can only do part of the
That's
job,
right. And what was beautiful was after the end of that, it was supposed to be a 12-month period, and we extended to 18 months. After that, the first CEO or executive director of NetHope was Molly Chang, who worked at Cisco, and the second was Lauren. Then there was Bill Brindley. There were several people, and then we had Lauren Woodman, he worked at Microsoft. So you actually saw Intel was a big investor in that as well, and that was the point. It wasn't, we didn't brand it Cisco. It shouldn't have been branded Cisco. Was that we wanted the organization to succeed, and it would take a lot of different actors to get it there, and that's what we were able to have, and that's why it's still here today. Mm-hmm.
A question occurs to me that, like you said, after 2001 and the layoffs, and you mentioned that, different product lines were being shut down, or things, that Cisco was trying to focus its business and succeed through this difficult time. Was there ever a question that this philanthropic endeavor, corporate affairs, would also have to be reduced or eliminated?
No,
Okay.
never. So let me share with you what actually happened. At the end of the 18-month period, 40% of the employees came back to Cisco, 40% worked in the nonprofit sector, and 20% left to other companies. Okay, so that was one. We also measured down to the impact. So let's take Second Harvest Food Bank. They're local. They're a food distribution environment. So they actually then distribute. They collect, package, and distribute to soup kitchens, churches, things like that, to the elderly, homeless, everything. And what happened is we put some people on there. They looked at it as a supply chain challenge. They looked at where, because they have food that they have to purchase, food that they get donated. You have to, the logistics of it, the coordination, the scheduling, make sure things don't spoil. I mean, anything you have in the food service industry, you had there. They were able to work on their systems, again, technology and process, that they were able to save enough money because of that so they could do an additional 1.2 million meals as a result of the savings. Those are tangible metrics. So we did all of that. We also had the impact it had on the employees. We did not talk about this, but I think it was San Jose Mercury and some of the newspapers actually outed Cisco that we were working on, this. And I'll talk about why we didn't publicize in a minute. But because of that, our employees learned, a lot of the mass employees who weren't directly engaged learned about it from what they read in the newspaper. And they, on a survey at the end of that trying dark ages of learning period, they actually said the highlight of the year was that program, that the company would do that. And then the third thing that happened was I was getting calls from other companies saying, look, I'm really sorry, I have to ask you this. Their budgets had been cut, so they can't help this organization. Could you step in? So all of these things are happening. And one of the things that you talk about, leadership really shows up when times are bad. Not just bad that everybody's suffering, but bad for you, bad for your company. It was a very challenging time. John Chambers, man, really showed, well, first of all, his resilience. He has a toughness that you will not find, unmatched by most people. And he took every hit that was out there. You read the articles of what was happening. He took it and shielded everybody from it. He took every hit out there. And yet he said, we're going to double down. And that's what he did. They put more money into the foundation. They put more money into my organization. We put more money into the community. He held me to a very high bar. Believe me, you don't go have a conversation with John Chambers without having your numbers straight, right? He came from sales. He knows his numbers. And that just made us better. It just made us better.
So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about because this has been my area of focus for the last several months, is about disaster response. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can say a little bit about the Cisco culture around immediate disaster response and customer advocacy and disaster response.
So I would say that even before 9/11, 9/11 was when you really saw everything that the company had done up to that point was in readiness for what happened after 9/11. When you think about all those financial institutions, all the institutions in New York who had to get back on their feet, in the Pentagon who had to get back on their feet, and all of that. Everything that came before was training for that. And what happened was there's many occasions, but one that stands out was some of the refugee situation in like 1998, 1999, around that period, Kosovo and all of that was happening. I think that was, I don't know, you better check the dates, but I think that's what it was. We had employees both locally and at headquarters who felt we needed to go and put the infrastructure together, and they went. They got permission from their bosses. This is a precursor to DIRT, the Disaster Incident Response Team, and I think they call it something else now. And they went out there and they set up networks so that people could find each other. Families could find each other. So it was those instances that set us up for the readiness that happened in 9/11, and then we had the business. And after 9/11, it wasn't just people who were being in the volunteer. It was people's core jobs to go out there and get all the networks up and running, and wanted it to be very unpublicized, because it's just what we do for our customers. We didn't want to take advantage of that or anything like that. And then when you saw the tsunami, and what happened is that they had come up with a portable, I think it was 69 pounds. But at the time, it was a portable.
It was as portable as Cisco equipment got.
Exactly,
a
little. Yeah. But 69 pounds was little, because normally you'd have, you've seen our gear. It's like it's like a pallet. And this was a 69-pound portable communication system with the satellite. And I think we worked with Inmarsat or something like that, and took it into Banda Aceh. And I remember over that weekend, we were checking our voicemails at the time. And, because personal devices were not common at that point in time. And what happened was there was one message that said, if you hear this message, then we are good to go. This is coming from Banda Aceh, and we knew. That's when I knew. It was like, I don't know, 1 a.m. or something. But that's when I knew that I could take a breath that weekend, because everybody was on high alert and figuring that out. So that's when the convergence of disaster response, integration, and all of that really solidified. Up until then, it was always, I'd call somebody and they'd say, okay, I got this, let me send this out for you. Oh, you know what? If your budget pays for their airfare, then so-and-so wants to go out there and set it up. And this is where NetHope really came into play, because they were local and they had, boots on the ground, so to speak, as an NGO, and we could train, some of them on the equipment or work in tandem with them. And, we've done that ever since, whether it was Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and a whole slew of things that have been happening since then.
Mm-hmm. So initially, for many years, crisis response, what's now called crisis response, was in a totally different part of the company than where you were.
It was in the TAC, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So how did you...
They came to us.
They came to you.
So you know what? My philosophy is I don't care where you work. We're all part of the Cisco family, and we're all going to work together, and we did. So it didn't really matter where people reported. And to this day, there's people in the business who pitch in. And also, you have to talk about, if you've talked to the dirt people, when you talk to the dirt people, it is not just the people who do the volunteerism. I think at the time, at one point, they were at 400 strong of people who are volunteers. It's not just them. It's their teammates, because when they come out of their business to go off and respond to a disaster, everybody else has to pick up the slack. And so, to me, dirt was everybody. Because somebody had to pick up the slack. The managers, had to feel comfortable, and they paid for these employees to go, and house them and all of that. So that was happening all along. We worked very closely together, and then in 2000, I want to say 18, 19, was it 2019 or 18? They had reached out to me and said, since you work more with them than we do, maybe we should combine them. And so they were the ones who said maybe we should combine them in the corporate affairs organization, and that's how it happened. So yeah. People find ways that are efficient. Now, having said that, I was funding a lot of those people as well. So we would fund them, like Matt Altman, who's been seconded with NetHope, has been funded through our organization. So we would fund them because they were an integral part of it. And when budgets got tight, I didn't want to put them in a situation where they have to decide, do I do this or do I do that? So, and that's just part of the culture.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there are several moments in this journey where the immediate disaster got an immediate crisis response, followed on by a longer-term development investment. A couple of the other ones that I have on my list would be the Sichuan earthquake and were you involved with the rebuilding endeavor after
every single
the
one was involved. So you can start with Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah,
absolutely. There's crisis response. So, and this happened in crisis response there, in Sichuan, in the wildfire. I mean, like there is. We counted that in 1 year there were like 12 major, not little, but major disasters, unfortunately. So in any situation like that, the immediate is, what can we do? So whether it was a healthcare issue and putting WebEx so that they could communicate with specialists in Baltimore, Maryland at Johns Hopkins to a remote site somewhere, Hurricane Maria, all of those things. So there was a working with NetHope, Cisco, and working with the government. They had set up this command center, and they were there while their families, our employees' families, were living in the Cisco offices. The employees were then
in Puerto Rico.
In Puerto Rico, employees were then themselves in the convention center, wherever they had set up this crisis center that the government had, and working to get them up and running. And so you had this happening, and that happened that was for a long period of time. It probably felt really long for the people living in the office. But then afterwards, we make investments for development, which is how do we then get them back on their feet. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, it was rebuilding for 21st century education. How do we work strategically so they build back beyond what they were and position them for the future? So that's just a natural part of it, unless we say up front our role is just for disaster. And sometimes you do that. If it's a wildfire, it's just the disaster piece, and there are other organizations who are better positioned to help rebuild, people in forestry, people, those kinds of things. So we leave it to the experts to do their job. Our point is not to do their jobs for them. You don't become a good partner that way.
Would you say that sort of dynamic of immediate response and long-term response is something that Cisco tends to do more than other companies?
I like to say so. It was probably true when we started doing that. I like to believe that it's much more than that now. And we are all so much more sophisticated, and organizations, NGOs are much more sophisticated too. So the point is it's evolving, and one of the things that I know about Cisco is our ability to pivot, adapt, and change, whether because the economy's changed, because new technologies are there, that new processes have been adopted, all of that, is that it has to change constantly. It's not, nothing is static.
Let's see it. One of the more recent endeavors that I was looking at was the Service Year Alliance. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, service. Okay, so the AmeriCorps program was something that both Presidents, Herbert Walker Bush and President Clinton were both very passionate about. And it was about doing a year of service. And in some instances, people did a year of service as part of a court order. In other instances, people were taking kind of a gap year. And in other instances, people were doing a year of service between graduating from your undergraduate degree before you went on to get a master's degree. So it was a whole slew of people. And, as you know, part of the AmeriCorps program included, Teach for America. So I remember going to several classrooms, and you saw a medical student, a pre-med student who wanted to take a couple of years in the community. A lot of people you probably know have done that. So AmeriCorps, Teach for America, things like that. And City Year was one of the critical organizations that we partnered with. And in fact, in San Jose, at the time, Mayor Susan Hammer welcomed City Year here in Silicon Valley. So that was one that we had partnered with. And what we saw was that City Year was embedded in some of the school systems, and they had a very specific program called the ABCs, which is attendance, classroom activity. So there was a very specific thing, achievement, all of that. There's very specific things that they were doing that they could measure success for a student. And when the test scores came out, the schools that City Year was seconded to actually had higher test scores. So you'd have to go back. I don't have the specific dates and our data, but what we were seeing is this trend. And so City Year was a partnership that we really believed in. And as is with appropriations, money's tight everywhere, and so they had really worked to, lobby for additional funding for AmeriCorps, basically, more slots than they had, and Congress has been very supportive of that over the years. But obviously, everybody wants more than they're actually going to get. And what we found was that this new resurgence of service was so important in a country so divided. And that, can we use service as a way of bringing us together because we care about common interests like education, environment, things like that, community, the arts, all of those things, economic development. And so that's how the Service Year Alliance was started, with an underpinning of technology, which is that can we create a marketplace where people can apply and find opportunities, find stipends and funding, because again, volunteerism and service should not be the exclusive purview of those who can afford not to get paid. And so there's some parents said, look, I think this is great for my kid, but we don't need to get paid for it. Let them do it a year of service without being paid, where somebody else says, I would love to help my community, but I've got to pay for my college. So we created this platform, Service Year Alliance platform, that we worked with the Service Year Alliance organization to get off the ground. And, it's just something that, the goal is every time you meet somebody, one of the things you might ask in part of your conversation is, where did you do your year of service? And so that's kind of the goal. It's a journey still. With a lot of successes, but also the constant need for funding, and it can't just be single donations from individuals. It really has to be institutional and funded, government funded.
All of these programs, it seems to me, need to have that long-term
That's right.
some long-term stability to make the investment worthwhile, right?
We usually go for 3 to 5 years. We think that that's a good measurement. Beyond 5 years means that you're underpinning an organization, and that's never a good thing, right? And we also require other funders so that it is a true long-term partnership. Yeah.
I want to ask you about how you conceptualize these different terms that we have talked about already today, but that surround this work. Like you said, you had to find a name for the department in the beginning, right? Philanthropy wasn't the right, didn't feel like the right term. So corporate affairs. But then we've
corporate
also,
affairs and CSR.
right, we've also had corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, and I think it'll end sustainability. So what happens is you morph and change. It was corporate philanthropy, then it was corporate affairs, and it was corporate affairs and CSR, and then corporate affairs, CSR, and sustainability. And I don't know what the new name's going to be. Don't know. And it shouldn't be hinged on a name. The name should describe what you're doing. So yeah. And everybody does it a little differently.
So when it was called corporate social responsibility, how did you see, what would you put in the bucket of corporate social responsibility?
Well, the foundation, all the educational engagements, environmental piece of it. It was, the venture investments. It was all the strategic alliances. So it was the things that at the end of the day, shareholders don't measure you on it, and yet they value the outcomes because they're very specific. That they feel good that their money was stewarded properly. I think that our shareholders are very savvy, and I don't think they're one-dimensional either. They want good returns, and they should expect good returns on their investment, but also knowing that part of being a corporation and being in servicing our customers is that the community surrounding all of that is where you get your employee base from. It's the health of that community that enables you as a corporation to thrive. It's the environment where innovation happens and all of that. And shareholders understand that. They just want to make sure you have outcomes, that it's stewarded responsibly. Yeah.
When you add sustainability to that, what changed, or did anything change
well,
in what
changed.
you were doing?
I'll tell you a lot changed because sustainability is more than just what we can do for others. Sustainability is really about how we comport ourselves as a company, as an institution, an organization. And so part of our work was internal. So we went through, and I talked about this internal research organization. They went through in partnering and working with every single organization that, supply chain was a big part of it, sales, all of those organizations, to real engineering. What is our current footprint? What are we doing to mitigate that? What are the opportunities of renewable energy? What are the legal things that are required? Because in the UK, they have this requirement that you commit to NetZero by 2025. And then look at the big landscape and said, well, we predict that by this period of time, the grid will be green. So the more greener the grid, the less pressure on us, because you also don't want to stymie progress. Networks are only going to get bigger. You need more powerful networks. You have to be able to have powerful security, and all these things take energy. So how do you continue to do that at the same time understand what your outputs are, and then how do you mitigate that? So you have to calculate and predict, and we do a prediction, do an assessment in research of what percentage of each country uses renewable now, have laws in place to force renewable, so that you'll have a green grid, which will then offset some of our stuff. And so all of that has to be integrated together. It is an orchestration of massive proportions, and working through all that and then getting the calculations and getting the reporting. We did reporting when a lot of people weren't reporting. We went since 2000, and I think our first CSR report was, do I want to say 2003 or 2000? Yeah, something like that.
It was very early.
It was very early. I hope that's in our archives. And that document, and we said we didn't do it for pillar huggers, or tree huggers. This is about us as our own sustainability as a company, both financially and in the presence of various places that we want to do business. We started reporting then. We got better at it over time, and I was one of the people, there was a bunch of us who actually put it together, and I'm happy to say more professionals came in after us since then, because we turned it into a very well-oiled machine. But, we went through, and it was not easy getting those numbers, but we did all of those things, and so we said, this is what we can do now. Now it's time to look at the business. And then we started working with manufacturing and supply chain. And then we started working with engineering. That was a decades-long journey to get there, to make the recommendation that, yes, we can get there. And we're probably going to get there in 2023. And that's how we were able to make a corporate commitment last fall. So these are some of the things that you did over time, but somebody had to steward that. And that's why we had the corporate affairs tag, because it was more than just one thing. Is that there will be things that will be asked of companies as you adapt, and somebody has to steward it. You don't own it. I can't own that. I did own the recommendation, but a lot of other people owned the data that came in with it, and now it's up to the next phase. So it depends on what we're focusing on. Does engineering need to own it for a while? Does supply chain need to own it? So that's basically the process, but it's a very practical approach to getting things done. Nothing to do with ownership other than delivery. So it was a beautiful process. It brought out the best in people, and I saw the best in people, and people who don't always collaborating. And that's always a great way, to work. It's a great work environment.
Who were some of I would love to get some names of people that you worked with, who worked for you, who really were instrumental in this.
Well, I think Peter Tavernese. I think Peter Tavernese is a really his is a beautiful story, and it's his to tell. So I'm sure you've talked to him. I encourage you to. He was actually one of the employees who was impacted by the bubble bursting. So what he did was, he hadn't been with us very long when all these changes were happening. So he actually was seconded to Public Allies in North Carolina for 18 months. And then we brought him and had him work for our organization. He ran the foundation for a while, and now he's focused on sustainability. So I would say he would be, a key person in this. You had, oh my gosh, there's so many people through the years. Mike Utrenka, and he is very integral he also ran the foundation for a while. I like to use the foundation as a place to train people and cycle people in, and I think Mike Utrenka did a really great job of turning building an infrastructure around the foundation. And he also sits on some local boards, here. I think it was Network for Good. He sat on that board. That was one of our early collaborations with AOL, which was AOL then, because they had this NetGive platform, and how we partnered with them to take it beyond that. So, you had that. Mary D. Wysocki, who's now the Cisco Chief Sustainability Officer at Cisco, Amanda Cumberland, who led the research for Network Academies, Amy Kristin, who really helped with the Networking Academy program and getting that into a transition from a startup to a, an organization. I could go on and on and on, but I would also say Joe Pinto, who ran the TAC, the Technical Assistance Center, and TAC Ops as well. John Chambers, obviously, John Morgridge. John Morgridge was the quintessential on-the-ground person. He always, so he made a personal investment, and John Chambers went too, but John Morgridge went multiple times to Mississippi, Louisiana. And he's done habitat builds and all of those things. And he's a very practical, hands-on person. You have an interview with him, but he's just, and he has stories that, beyond. Who else can I give you? I can give you so many names. I don't even know where to start. There's just so many names. I can give you a whole list of them. But you know what? They're remarkable people. They're remarkable people who do remarkable things, and I feel very blessed that I get to know them and everything they did for the community. It was remarkable. Yeah.
Can you speak at all to any of the endeavors that were just didn't quite get off the ground or didn't go the direction you wanted them to go? Those challenging ones from which you learned things.
Okay, I don't want to name names because it gets a little dicey. But we have an organization that we've worked with multiple times, sometimes very successfully, sometimes not so much. It was a healthcare initiative, and it was good in that they set up remote healthcare. So they were able to set up a remote healthcare organization, and some good outcomes. It wasn't just, we had to take into the fact that not everybody owned a laptop. So it wasn't like 2020. I think the COVID was really an important watershed moment, because this is where you realize that affordable internet access is a human right. I'm going to say it again. Affordable internet access for everyone is a human right. It's like air and water, because so much of what you need, it's not just education and learning about jobs, it's healthcare and all these other things. But we'd been working on that long before. So in the beginning, it was really, we had some instances where what they wanted us to do was provide all this stuff and then pay for their internet service. Well, we're not an internet service provider. So we had to work with them to find an internet service provider who would give them, affordable service in order to be able to do anything across the network. So those were the challenging things, and if they couldn't get that, then we wouldn't start the project, because there's no point. Otherwise, it's just stuff that's sitting around. We had some instances of that. Early on, we'd worked with an NGO where we felt the executive director was, we didn't feel confident that they were managing the budget appropriately. So, we did audit them. By the way, we audit ourselves every year. We do we have a third party who comes and does an audit of the foundation and of our donations ourselves, and then the company took it over. So then they do internal audit and external audit as well, so that we can say that, and that was something we wanted to get done. So we do that, and then and sometimes it can be frustrating for the employees when they want an organization to be approved. The vetting process, that was kind of dicey. Because they wanted it yesterday, and we also have to adhere to the Patriot Act, right? Which is that any 501c3, just because they're a 501c3, does not mean that you're off the hook. You have to do some vetting there, and that creates raging debate. It's like we need to get it to them now, and yet when you do and something goes wrong, nobody wants to be held accountable for that. So there's some of that, and Peter really had to do a lot of discipline around that. Somebody has to toe the line. Somebody has to keep an eye out on these things, even though emotions are high because we're trying to help people. So you deal with that. Yeah. So you learn from your failures and you learn from your successes, but the opportunity when you have a multi-year partnership is that you have time to fix it. When you work with a customer and things go wrong, you don't just walk away. And one of the things I've learned in the business side is that sometimes when you face challenges, when you and that customer work together to resolve it, for some reason, that relationship is stronger than it would have been had you had no problems at all.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's the same principle that we have to apply. If we have a multi-year partnership with somebody and something goes wrong, we have to make the effort to fix it and figure out how do we ameliorate it. We have to be upfront, report it, acknowledge it, has to be in the audit, be upfront about it, and then publish what went right and what not to do again, because then you can be of service to other organizations so they don't step in that same quagmire that you were in before. So, yeah, and that's why I believe in multi-year partnerships. That's the bottom line.
As daunting as they can be, but I think from the side of looking at it from the side of the nonprofit partner, and having been in that role myself in the past, that there's nothing worse than feeling like this corporate entity is just writing us a check or giving us gear and dropping us, right? That they're kind of leaving us out here hanging with what little training and skill we have in this area, and what is much more valuable is that investment,
That's
that
right.
long-term investment, that support, that advocacy.
You're better off not investing if you're going to do it just 1 year, because you get them to a point where they've changed their systems and their infrastructure, and then you leave them hanging. It's almost they're in a worse situation than before you showed up. It's just before you showed up. Yeah.
Let's see what else there was on my list here. I think Peter mentioned to me the Least Developed Country Initiative.
Well, that's part of Networking Academies, is that we made commitments in the LDCs, the least developed countries, and that was one of the reasons why we put Network Academies in Afghanistan, at Kabul University, to do that.
I also noticed, as I was looking a little bit at Network Academy, at the really long-term lifespan of these,
Well, we had three major what I call reassessment times. So when it first came out, they also were doing bodies and seats, which is just number of people who enrolled. And we did some research, and what I found was that you had this number, but after 3 months you had this number. And so you can't claim this number, you have to claim this number.
So the first number is the number of
people who registered.
People who enrolled.
And in some countries, it's, the state pays for education, so people enroll in everything, and then they whittle it down. You have to take that into consideration. And then it was just how many academies were open, which was it was impressive. But then you had to say how many of them are still in operation. So we've built in mechanisms by which we look at the data and then we look at the relevance of the data. So it's great that you have, this many students who registered. Now you have to see how many actually, attended and took a class and took a test. And then you look at how many actually, finished the course, and then how many people actually passed a certification. So some of the certifications didn't, some people, as soon as they finished the course, they got jobs, so they didn't have to take a certification. Other people felt that certifications were so critical, they took it. So you have to measure it in relevance and value. So when it came out, it went gangbusters. It was amazing. And then what we found was people were less there was a period where people were less interested in networking, more interested in web development. I think we went through that. So you have to, like I said, you have to be able to pivot and adapt and focus on things you actually can add value to. So that happened, and then there was a time where we said, okay, do we just say, sunset this program? Like you would do with any business. You always reassessed, and every time we did that, the numbers spoke for themselves, and people were still engaged in it. And what we found particularly was that in some countries, women were not allowed to be in classrooms with men. So, and some of them couldn't, just for cultural tenets, they were not allowed to, for instance, attend school in a certain manner. But because the academies were virtual, you saw a lot of women in these countries who actually could attend, take the courses, get the skills, and more importantly, participate in the workforce. And so those were the reasons why we saw, this is where we doubled down. We saw like some of the highest growth was in Africa. You saw a lot of, Africa, Middle East, India, places like that where there was a lot of growth in terms of women. You saw the network academies being applied to those with learning challenges and disabilities, or as we like to call different abilities. And so you see the academy program around that. So there was a lot of ways to apply the academy program to various initiatives around the world, and that's what you saw happening there. And it's been through multiple generations, and just amazing number of multiple millions of students who've gone through the program. We've had people who were students who became instructors who went on to be in top level positions in various organizations. It's just that's when you wake up and say, this is why I do what I do, is when you see that.
Another one that Peter mentioned to me was the Partnership for Lebanon.
Okay, so that happened between the conflict that was happening in Lebanon, and this was President George Walker Bush, who asked companies and organizations to go in and support, the development of education and economic development. And so John Chambers and various CEOs went to Lebanon to look at opportunities. And what happened is the State Department had actually set up a program where they would have students from Lebanon who can come to the States and do internships. And so Intel, Cisco, I think Microsoft, there was several companies who actually took in interns, and they worked here, and then they went back, and some of them were employed by our offices there. So, yeah.
That seems to me a little bit of a smaller scale effort than some of the other endeavors.
It was a effort that was needed at the time, and that was supported by the State Department and the government. And so, you see yourself partnering with states and governments. There's a lot of things that we did around through COVID in terms of helping communities, and a lot of that involved partnering with counties and states as well. Yeah. The World Economic Forum.
That was the next thing on my list. You're reading my mind.
So this is back in 2003, and John Chambers was at the World Economic Forum. And as part of a group of leading CEOs, they all talked about the fact that we all had education programs going, all of us. And how do we focus our effort, harness it together on a single exemplar? And at the time, His Majesty King Abdullah of Jordan was there, and they were working on a program called RFK, which is E-Readiness for a Knowledge Economy. And they really wanted to see, to be the test bed for an educational initiative that was really focused on 21st century. And of course, it's right up our alley. So I'd like to say we signed on, but John Chambers signed us up, which is John Chambers. That's what he does. In his own way, he saw something here that a lot of other people didn't see. And so it was very exciting to get to work with other companies. And, again, our partners, Microsoft, Intel, Cisco, a whole bunch of companies. It was like 17 companies. that or external and internals, because we wanted local companies as well to be engaged, some NGOs, and we worked on, the Jordan Education Initiative, and it was really interesting when the Minister of Education stood up and said, because of this, they saw that their PISA scores had gone up. It was just really fascinating. And one of the most important things for me personally was meeting some of the local entrepreneurs in Jordan. And one particular is Rubicon. And it was a woman entrepreneur, and I think she was the Arab Entrepreneur of the Year, back in the mid-2000s. And she had started this company around 3D, 4D media. And what she did, it was fascinating. She needed talent. So what she did was she rented out a cyber cafe and put an ad out in the newspaper for local, people who either understood the space, because she did a lot of animation, or wanted to learn this space. And this is what's so interesting, is that she didn't just want experts hit the ground running fast. She also wanted to invest in people. They had so many people that registered that she had to run a second cyber cafe and run another. And what they, and I think the gist of what she was pitching to them is, best case you get a job, worst case you learn a skill. Right. And hired up some of the best people, and she did a lot of the animation for, we supported the math curriculum. Cisco sponsored the math curriculum, and we sent some of our people who did Network Academy, developers there, to do knowledge transfer, to teach her team how to do it, and then they left, and then they took over from there. And what you saw was that she built a budding business from that. So, it's just amazing what you see, and people who get along because they have common interests. And that was really eye-opening, and I think it was an enriching and growing experience for our team as well while we were there. And we got very close to the Microsoft and Intel teams, which is fantastic. Yeah.
I wonder if you would speak to some of the criticisms that you have heard over the years around corporate philanthropy and.
So I think, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I do know that in the early days, people used to call it executive special interest. And that was one of the reasons why John Chambers was really good about letting the organization decide. He did not tell you had to do these things. The organization, based on research and good business planning, all the things that they expect us to have when we show up every day. Because what a lot of the NGOs, because I did a lot of fact finding, I spent a lot of time in the field, and actually that was probably the best grounding for me, is to be in the field, not at corporate. And I spent a lot of time, and what a lot of organizations said was this, they'll say company X was fantastic. Oh, they helped us do this, and there was a whole list of all these things, and they said, and then the CEO or the executive left, right. And there was, nobody picked it up from there. And now we're scrambling, and so it's and now people expect us to be there, and we can't be there for them. So I think that was the biggest criticism, and how important it is that an organization makes these decisions and they're not executive special interest or special projects, because what you hear is people saying, well, no, it's not really, but I got to do it because of. You don't want that, because then it becomes less authentic to the employees, and you need the employees. It's the groundswell of support that actually makes things happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you about how the culture of philanthropy at Cisco is communicated, mm-hmm. how it disseminates throughout the company globally.
Mm-hmm. So I would actually say that it's like any other, which is what you always want. It's like any other department at Cisco. So somebody said to me, as a little vignette, somebody said to me, well, I don't know why every single person doesn't know about this. So I said, tell me what you know about 5G and what we're doing. They stumped them. So this is the common dilemma, and this is the way it's supposed to be, is that, there's so much information to relay. we work with the corporate communications teams and they disseminate it, but just because we disseminate it doesn't mean that it's absorbed. In the same way, we have a big launch and we're all talking about these things, and yet the same person who complains that everybody doesn't know about their work, when you ask them about somebody else's work, they don't know either. So then all of a sudden they get that little sheepish look on their face. Okay, I get it. Having said that, it is treated like any other department within the company, and we do, get on CEC, which is the Cisco employee, page. We do have, when we have a launch, it is highlighted in company meetings. So it's just like any other department.
I think my last question for you is about your perspective on the role that technology companies have in making an impact. Do technologies have a particularly special call to do something?
That's an interesting question. Do I think that technology companies have a specific responsibility? Yes. But I think every company has a responsibility on having impact. If you're distributing baby formula or medicine, they're highly regulated, so they do have very specific things they have to address. So that's built into some of those companies. But I think every company has a responsibility that they do what they say they're going to do, and all their claims are accurate. Right? And when we make a mistake, we should be very upfront about it. That's why the reporting becomes so important. Highlight what we did well, what we didn't do well, where we fell short, and so forth. When it comes to tech companies, I guess, if your question is, do we have an extra bit of responsibility, the only way I would say yes to that is because we're ubiquitous. And it's not just we, it's the technology. Every company is a technology company. Particularly now, is that there is not a single thing out there that does not have some sort of a technology component to it. So I think that it's just a level playing field, that we do have to be particularly vigilant because, we're a horizontal thread maybe in so many places. But at the end of the day, we answer to the people we serve, and we do have a responsibility, and it's up to us in terms of how we steward that.
Those are all my questions for today.
This
Do you
is
have
great.
anything else you want to share before we stop?
I had some thoughts, but of course they've disappeared because there's so much to talk about. I would say that in the future, the way we look at corporate responsibility is going to change, and it's not about talking about it. I think the measurements are going to be much more obvious. I do believe we have a generation coming of age where this isn't special, it's just something you do, which makes this generation so exciting. It's exciting to work with them, it's exciting to see how they think and where they're going. I think that, there's also this integration and collaboration because we live in a multi-generation workforce. And communities have always been multi-generation, and I think the workforce is mirroring that now. And so you have, pulling ideas from all of it. You see the regeneration of things that were popular in the 80s. I always say to people, everything old is new again, with a different spin and a different tagline, but it's basically the same stuff that's been spiffed up because we have newer technologies with which to spiff them up. So I think that, you will see the space change and morph and hopefully become more ubiquitous, because I think that's how people think about this. And it's not just this generation. I say that many generations of the workforce have cared very deeply. It's just that it's more open and accepted and expected now than it was before. So overall, I'm kind of bullish on mankind.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tae.
Thank you.